Welcome to What is True. I'm Don Patton. Together with Dennis Carroll, we talk to you about truth on Sunday mornings. We're glad you're tuned in. We'd like to talk to you this morning about the truth regarding worship. There are many people in our society who openly affirm that formal worship, as they call it, is just not important anymore. Organized religion is a turnoff. Going to worship is something that is old-fashioned and no longer a part of, with it, Christianity. Gallup documents these attitudes with a poll just last year, pointing out 2 decades ago, an average of 42% of U.S. adults attended religious services every week. And then they say a decade ago, not two, a decade ago, the figure fell to 38, and then state it is currently at 30, down from 42 just 20 years ago. This is a disturbing trend, and Christians who know what the Bible says ought to know better. But we hear people saying it's all about the heart, and it's the heart that matters. And while that is certainly critical in our service to God, the idea that that's all that matters is certainly contradicted by Christ when he says, if you love me, if you've got your heart where it ought to be, you will keep my commandments. If you don't, then your heart's not right. And we hear people saying, well, I can worship God anywhere. Well, in a sense that's true, but one place where you cannot worship God is in the state of rebellion to his commandments. We need to know what he says. Psalm 2, worship God, in verse 11, with reverence. But that worship was highly regulated, and that's really an understatement. Notice in Hebrews chapter 9, the writer speaking to Christians there reminds them that even the first covenant, now it's true of the second, but even the first had regulations of divine worship and the earthly sanctuary. And we of course read of those regulations in great detail in the Old Testament. In Exodus 25 we read, according to all that I'm going to show you as the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of the furniture, so you shall construct it. You do it this way, not your way. And again in verse 40 in the same chapter, see to it that you make them by the pattern which was shown to you in the mountain. In Hebrews chapter 8, the writer refers these Hebrews who were familiar with the Old Testament to that point, saying, just as Moses, you do in this area, this particular requirement, just as Moses, who was warned by God when he was about to make the tabernacle, see that you make all things according to the pattern. You had to follow the regulations for worship in order to be. It's not just any kind of worship you want. John 4, you find Jesus having a conversation on this very point with the woman at the well. You worship what you do not know. Now, she was worshiping at Mount Gerizim. The regulations of the Old Testament required going to the temple in Jerusalem. Well, you didn't know that. You weren't taught that. You weren't worshiping according to knowledge. We worship what we know. We're following the regulations. And then he points forward to the new covenant and saying, true worshipers, and that would imply there's some that are not true worship. You can worship and not be a true worshiper, a false worshiper, like she was. True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit, that is, with all of their heart, that's important, and in truth. Now that's where she had failed, and where many today fail. You got to follow the Lord's commandments if you're going to be pleasing to him. True worshipers not only worship in spirit and in truth, but the first part of it, they worship And that means you go to the place where God has ordained. We know the Ethiopian eunuch had traveled 1,200 miles to go to Jerusalem, which was required under the Old Covenant. He had to come to Jerusalem. Well, you can worship it. Well, no, he knew better, and he came to where that old law required. In Revelation, we see the picture of the 24 elders. They'll fall down before him who sits on the throne. They will worship him. This is important, and it's important that we do it in spirit and in truth. Let's look at some of the Old Testament requirements, which are written, we're told in 1 Corinthians 10, as an example. They were written for our instruction today. Likewise, in Galatians chapter 3, the law has become our guardian to lead us to Christ. Well, let's be led by the law. And we find hundreds of times in the New Testament the reference back to the Old to make application of those points that are still applicable today. This one isn't, but it illustrates God's attitude toward his requirements. While the sons of Israel in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. They were required not to do that. They couldn't do work on the Sabbath. Well, but he was just gathering wood. There's nothing wrong with that, except God said, don't do it. The Lord said to Moses, the man shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And that's exactly what they did. All the congregation brought him outside of the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord commanded. Now, that sends shivers up and down our spines, and we wouldn't do it that way, but that's what God commanded, and what he requires is often contrary to what we want. Our choice isn't the thing that is to be followed, obviously. Sometimes people say, well, now you can get too carried away and be too particular in your worship to God, and that's what Jesus was condemning in Matthew 23 when he said, woe to you, for you tithe the mint and the dill and the cumin, the little small flavoring herbs. That would make sure a tenth got contributed, and woe to you for that, as if this is wrong. That's not what the passage teaches at all. And they were doing that and neglecting the weightier provisions, justice and mercy, and in the face of the weightier matters being neglected, the attention to the tiny flavoring herbs was absurd, obviously hypocritical. Then he goes on to say, these are the things you should have done, without neglecting the others. That's just the opposite point of what is often heard from this passage. It's not that you shouldn't tithe the mint and the dill and the cumin. That's what you should do, Jesus said, without neglecting those weightier provisions of the law, which they were doing. Careful following precisely is exactly what Jesus said should be done, the things you should have done. The New Testament requirements show that the obligations, the regulations in the New Testament are even more stringent. That is, greater obligation, greater responsibility because of the greater privilege. Some say, well, they had to be careful in the old, but we don't have to today. No, I think the opposite is true. God says so. Hebrews chapter 9, he's making this point to the Christians. Even the first covenant had regulations of worship, and then goes on to say in verse 11, but when Christ appeared as high priest, the good thing, he entered through a greater and more perfect tabernacle. Point continues in verse 23, therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens, that's what they had in the Old Testament, to be cleansed with the heavenly things. Better sacrifices, than there's a step up in the sacrifices and their value and the real thing now as opposed to the shadow, and the step up in obligation. The law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, not the very form, can never, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make perfect. The point's made in chapter 10. Anyone who set aside Moses' law dies without mercy at the testimony of two or three witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who's trampled underfoot the Son of God? It was required, and death was the penalty if he violated even picking up sticks on the Sabbath. Under the Old Testament, much severer punishment is due those who do not keep the greater obligations of the greater sacrifice and the greater high priest, he continues in verse 21. We have a great high priest, therefore let us draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith. Included in that obligation, just 4 verses later, he says, not forsaking our own assembling together. That's part of the obligation of this greater obligation in the New Testament. It's not trivial, it's not insignificant, it's not up to us. Don't do it is the command. And regarding the commands of the apostles, the Apostle Paul said the things that we write are the commands of God. Don't forsake. And then warning in the very next verse, not forsaking the assembling together, for if you go on sinning willfully, he just said, don't do this, don't forsake the assembly. For if you go on sinning, next verse, this is the following verse, after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a fearful, terrifying expectation of judgment, a fury of fire which will... This is not comforting when you look at those who have decided, well, we don't want to be a part of the assembling together. That just won't fit with the commands of Christ. Christians are to worship, and they're to worship specifically on the Lord's Day as well as other days, following the example of those in the New Testament. It's not the Sabbath, but we are tutored, we are brought to the law by looking at the requirements of the Sabbath. But now then we have the Lord's Day that we follow. Philippians chapter 2, Paul says, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern. And the pattern that we see in the New Testament was they were worshiping on the Lord's Day. Now they would sometimes go in on the Sabbath to teach the Jews in the synagogue because they had assembled and that afforded an opportunity for them to teach. But they weren't observing the Sabbath. That was forbidden. Philippians 4 verse 9, the things you have learned and received, heard and practiced these things, the God of peace will be with you. In Acts 20, notice the pattern, the example of the Apostle Paul regarding worship. He reached Troas within 5 days and stayed there 7 days. Why did he stay 7 days? The 7th day was the first day. He was going to leave the next day. On the first day of the week, they were gathered together to break bread. Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day. It was the first day of the week. That was the pattern for gathering together to observe the Lord's Supper. And he stayed there so that he could do that and then leave the following day. In addition to the first day of the week, we find they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' doctrine, fellowship. They all the time were worshiping God and also fellowshipping or being at home with each other. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple. They brought him to Antioch for an entire year. They met with the church and taught considerable members. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when you come together, he's rebuking them for some of the practices that were inappropriate when they came together, but they were assembling, they were coming together. For verse 18, for in the first place, when you come together as the church, there were divisions which he condemned, but they were coming together as the church. This is not out in the woods by themselves. This is the pattern of the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 11. Therefore, when you meet together, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper, and that's what they should have been doing, but they were polluting that observance, and that's read about. You can read about that there in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. But they were meeting together, even in the Psalms, as we foresee the coming Messiah. He says, and they quote the Messiah, speaking, I will proclaim your name to the brethren in the midst of the congregation. I will sing your praise. The Messiah foresaw the assembling. The word church is translated assembly. That's what the church is, and that's what he was foreseeing. James chapter 2, he talks about the assembly of the brethren there. If a man comes into your church, your assembly, we're just commanded, notice it again from Hebrews chapter 10, not forsaking our own assembly together, but encouraging one another. It's not entirely about us for our benefit, but it is for the benefit of others that we can encourage by our presence or discourage by our absence. Don't forsake, assemble. You have the opportunity to encourage one another. Now, when you have an opportunity to do good, James in chapter 4 says this is a sin when you don't fulfill it. Whoever knows to do good does not do it is guilty of sin. We have the opportunity to encourage, we're told. So you see what was heard and seen and practiced by the apostles. On the first day of the week, they assembled. And some of them weren't behaving as they should. Paul was fixing that, but that's what the example is in the New Testament. We're told in Hebrews 6, that is Matthew 6, seek first his kingdom. This is the priority. It takes priority over the rest of our life. We are dedicated as a bondservant to the Lord Jesus Christ. I look at examples around me and I see some really encouraging things among our brethren. Let's just talk for a moment about some of them. I think when I think of examples of faithfulness and attendance of the dear sister in Cordele, Georgia, who was deaf, who was paralyzed in a wheelchair, and eyes dimmed, could barely see. But she insisted on attending. I was holding a meeting there, and there she was, and I was standing right beside her after services when one of the teenagers who had learned sign language was communicating to her and said, why are you here? You can't see, you can't hear, you're paralyzed. Why do you attend? She smiled. You could see those dim eyes twinkle. She said, I want people to know whose side I'm on. She was setting an example, and she was preaching a powerful lesson. I remember Sister Penny Pendleton, who was a dear sister from Birmingham, Alabama. I was preaching down in Panama City. She was taking care of her husband. He wasn't able to attend on Sunday morning. She was there. Sunday afternoon, I went by to visit to see how her husband was doing. And while we were there, some friends of hers from Birmingham came in and wanted to say hello. And they had explained that they were on vacation there in Panama City. And she looked at them. She was 92 years old. And when you get that age, she says, you can say whatever you need to say, and don't worry about it. You just say it anyway. And she did. She said, I didn't see you at worship this morning. Well, we're just here on vacation. She raised that finger. I've seen her do that before. I'd had that pointed at me before. It wasn't completely straight. She had to kind of angle it. She said, I don't want the Lord taking a vacation from me. you ought not to take a vacation from him. They got the point. She said it forcefully. There wasn't a bit of weakness in her voice. They got it. And guess what? They were there that night with all of their kids. I remember Sister Ruth Mayberry in Clarksville, Tennessee, who had 6 children under 16 years of age. Her husband had been unfaithful, was an alcoholic, was not supporting the family at all. A good portion of the 20 miles to service was on a dirt road, and she had a dilapidated old station wagon. She piled the 6 kids in. She was there every service, rain or snow. I can remember one Sunday when there was a foot of snow to deal with. She was there before everybody else with all of the kids. These are examples that preach powerful lessons, and the kind of examples that we find in the New Testament that make foolishness out of the idea that we don't need to attend worship. They did continually in the New Testament. The Lord warned forcefully about those who forsake the assembly. You need to be an example yourself. You are, whether you want to or not. The question is, are you a good one? And we'd like for you to assemble with us this morning at the church, Reservoir Road. We'll be there at 9:30 and 10 for Bible study and worship, and then again at 5 o'clock. We meet on Wednesday evening at 7:30. You're welcome. We want you to be with us. Thank you for tuning in this morning.